I'm Christopher Kaufman-Ilstrup. I'm the Executive Director at Vermont Humanities. There's a small but mighty group of you in the room, and there are more people online around the state on one of the first truly nice evenings to be walking around outside. So thank you for choosing to be here with us instead. I just have a couple of things to say and then turning it over.
Could you speak into the mic?
Yep.
So
Sorry.
Zoom picks it up?
I just have a couple of things to say before we get started about the current situation that we find ourselves in, which is that our national affiliate at Vermont Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, has been doged. You probably have been following that in the news. And all grants in all 56 states and territories have been canceled, which throws a $750,000 hole in our budget, but overall a $68 million hole in the humanities councils around the country. That is a big problem. Nevertheless, we persist. And we continue to do the work that we're doing. We're not backing down, and we continue to follow our mission. We have so far been able to replace some of that money with contributions from Vermonters and fortunately from the Federation of State Humanities Councils and the Mellon Foundation. Nevertheless, we are still looking for support in many different ways. We encourage you to write to Becca and Peter and Bernie and tell them to support the cultural agencies, IMLS, the NEH, the NEA, and others. And we encourage you to, if you can, support your local library, support your local humanities council, and your local museums who are struggling in this moment. We do have a challenge grant right now from the Mellon Foundation. Every dollar contributed to Vermont Humanities up to $50,000 is matched one for one. You can certainly go on our website and make a contribution, and it is double. So if you give us $100, Mom gives us another $100, and we have $200. And that would be very helpful indeed. With that, I will turn things over to our wonderful hosts here at the Athenaeum to introduce our speaker.
Hello, I'm Casey Will, and I'm the director here at the Athenaeum, for those of you I haven't yet met. And on behalf of the Athenaeum, I want to welcome you to the Snapshot event, Alexander von Humboldt and American Democracy, with Smithsonian Senior Curator Eleanor Jones Harvey. Snapshot is Vermont Humanities' weekly program that hosts a variety of speakers at public libraries to foster resilient communities through engaging conversations. We extend our thanks to our partners at Vermont Humanities as well as to the generous underwriters who make it possible for us to offer such rich programming. The sponsor of our entire Snapshot season is the Vermont Department of Libraries, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the Alma Gibbs Donshane Foundation. This program is sponsored by Otto and Associates. Before we come together tonight across the state to listen and learn, we're going to cover a few housekeeping items. Can you just please make sure your cell phones are off? And if you need to use the restroom, the elevator is over here in the corner, and you take it all the way down to the basement, turn to your left, and they're right there. If you would like to hear about our future programming, Linnell here has the sheet where you can sign up to get our newsletters. The next Snapshot event is called On Forgetting with Amherst College professor Eileen Stavens, and it will be hosted by the Norwich Public Library on May 21st. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Eleanor Jones Harvey is a senior curator of 18th and 19th century American art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She earned her BA with distinction in art history at the University of Virginia and a PhD from Yale University. Dr. Harvey studies the intersection of landscape painting and American culture, and in 2021 she organized the Civil War and American Art, which then traveled to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And her most recent project was Alexander von Humboldt in the United States, Art, Nature, and Culture, which was on view in 2020 and 2021. So, there is a
Check, check, check.
There we go. Good evening, and thank you for being here this evening. It is a pleasure to be back in St. Johnsbury. I was here a number of years ago speaking about your Bierstadt downstairs, and spent a glorious afternoon over at the Fairbanks dealing with the intersection of art and science there. In 2020, I did curate an exhibition on Alexander von Humboldt and the United States. And these are the galleries that we used for those in that exhibition. So it's a pleasure to be back here as part of the Vermont Humanities Council program, and there is no better subject than Humboldt and American democracy for a time like this. I'd like to begin with an understanding of who Humboldt is and why you should care. Alexander von Humboldt was one of the most widely recognized human beings alive on the planet during the 19th century. He lived to be 89 years old and traveled over 40,000 miles through 40 countries on 4 continents at a time when most people didn't stray farther than 25 miles from the place where they were born. During his long life, he published 36 books and wrote over 25,000 letters to a global audience. By his own admission, he slept maybe 4 hours a night and called coffee concentrated sunbeams. And he devoted his life to amassing the data that he needed to support what he called the unity of nature, or the web of life, theorizing that everything on the globe was interconnected: people, ecosystems, weather, and climate. It was a radical theory then, but it's one we pretty much take for granted today. So if you want to know more about Humboldt himself as a human being, we are very fortunate to have Andrea Wolf's prize-winning book, The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World, to rely on. It's an amazing and engaging book. If you haven't read it already, I would highly recommend it. It's really an opportunity to understand how this man's endless, restless curiosity created a different vision of the world in which we live. Humboldt consolidated decades of research and thinking in his book, Cosmos, subtitled A Physical Description of the Universe, that put him on the map and made him an international celebrity. And the chances are you're familiar with the name Cosmos because of this man. Carl Sagan in the 1970s created a TV series, Cosmos, based on Humboldt, and more recently, Neil deGrasse Tyson and Anne Druyan, Carl Sagan's widow, made a reboot of Cosmos, all of them grounded in that core idea that everything, from the outer atmosphere to the molecular level, is in some way interconnected. So what does that have to do with us and American democracy? Well, interestingly enough, Humboldt's quest for comparative data got its start when he received permission to spend 4 years in the South American colonies, then ruled by the King of Spain. And so between 1799 and 1804, Humboldt traveled through modern-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, followed by a year in Mexico. It is while he is in Mexico that he learns about the Louisiana Purchase. And it is in Havana, where he's preparing to return to Europe, that Humboldt is convinced that he should make a detour and come to the United States. Humboldt really wants to pay a visit to the 3rd President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. And the reason he wants to meet him is that Humboldt has grown up in Imperial Europe. He is born in Prussia, where there is a king. He will be raised watching Napoleon rise to power. He will find himself thwarted in his ability to travel by the internecine warfares between Spain, Portugal, England, and France. And he hopes, he really hopes, that American democracy will be a bellwether for how the world can adopt a better political system. But first he has to get there, and so he boards a ship and sails to Philadelphia. When Humboldt arrives in Philadelphia, he's not really convinced that as a young naturalist, and you can see he's in his early 30s at this point, Jefferson is 65, he's not really convinced that the president is going to make time for him. So he writes a suck-up letter of introduction, a snippet of which you see on this slide, in which he flatters Jefferson by saying that he has such a high admiration for his writings, meaning the Declaration of Independence, his actions as president, and the liberalism of his ideas, which have inspired me from my earliest youth, as Humboldt has read Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. He understands Jefferson's concern for finding America's voice on the international stage, and he really hopes that the ideal that all men are created equal will play out in the United States. So the man assigned to meet Humboldt at the docks and introduce him to the scientific community is this man, the artist, inventor, and museum director, Charles Willson Peale. Humboldt will spend 2 weeks with the American Philosophical Society members before traveling with Peale to Washington to meet the president. One of their first stops in Philly is Peale's museum, and you see him right now standing in front, pulling the curtain in the artist in his museum, a self-portrait that the artist made almost 20 years after Humboldt's visit. Here, Peale is welcoming you to the museum that encapsulates Humboldt's enthusiasm for using natural history as a way of learning about ourselves. I want you to focus on the detail on the left, and you'll notice that what Peale has done is combined art, natural history, and politics to create a museum that is in effect a civics lesson promoting American values. Portraits of American statesmen and scientists line the walls, and first among them is George Washington, positioned strategically and not accidentally above the case that contains a stuffed bald eagle. Those of you who are devotees of the colonial period will also recognize poor Ben Franklin's turkey, awaiting taxidermy in the foreground, having not been named America's national bird. But the point is that Peale's visitors understand that this museum is a classroom in which to absorb American precepts, take pride in our natural features, and to venerate our military, scientific, and political leaders. Peale's Museum is our first lifelong educational program, and by the time Humboldt returns to Europe, Charles Willson Peale will have painted this portrait of him and installed it alongside George Washington's and Lewis and Clark's up in that panoply of American heroes. In effect, we've adopted him as one of our own. So why would we want to adopt Humboldt? Well, again, one of the things Humboldt is enamored of is our functioning democracy. Humboldt and Napoleon, whom you see here, are born the same year, and that's about the only similarity between them. Napoleon's military ventures impeded Humboldt's research and travels. It blocked him from Italy, it blocked him from Egypt, and the bad blood between Napoleon and the leaders of Prussia, England, Spain, and Portugal meant it's tough for Humboldt physically to get around. Napoleon is, like any good monarch, insecure. And so as Humboldt's star rises, Napoleon chafes. He censors and intercepts Humboldt's mail. He ignores Humboldt at ceremonies. He belittles him. He tries to kick him out of the country as a spy. And if you put their lives in parallel, it becomes a really interesting commentary on why Humboldt's politics trended toward liberalism and democracy as a conscious rejection of Napoleonic values. It is that freedom of expression, the freedom of the press, the freedom of movement that Humboldt so desperately desires. It should come then as no surprise that Humboldt and Jefferson will become close friends, and that friendship will last the rest of Jefferson's life, and they will continue to correspond as long as Jefferson is alive. Humboldt had never met a ruler who treated him as an equal until he met Jefferson. Jefferson gave him free access to the president's house, the White House, all day and night. They exchanged information freely, and Humboldt expressed his fervent desire that America would continue to find ways to live up to the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence. It's important also that even during this visit, Humboldt is gently pushing on the fact that he also believes that we owe it to those ideals to abolish slavery and to create honorable treaties with our indigenous nations in order to live up to the full measure of all men being created equal. However, he's not really willing to tackle that head on with Jefferson because he really doesn't want to jeopardize the friendship. So he picks proxies, and foremost among them is Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury in whom Humboldt will confide. Humboldt will encourage Gallatin to go on and write the first ethnographic treatise on North American Indians, and Gallatin in turn will provide Humboldt with population statistics and our annual exports for his data. And it's William Thornton, the architect of the Capitol, who will be the person who receives Humboldt's letters about American slavery. In one of them, Humboldt writes to him and says, "This abominable law that permits the importation of Negroes in South Carolina is a disgrace for a state in which I know many level-headed people to live. Conforming to the only course of action dictated by humanity, undoubtedly less cotton will be exported at first, but alas, how I detest politics that measures and evaluates the public welfare simply according to the value of its exports. The wealth of nations is like the wealth of individuals. It is only secondary to our happiness. Before one is free, one must be just, and without justice, there is no lasting prosperity. It is that kind of full-throated expression that Humboldt is more than willing to aim at his collateral targets, hoping that the message will get to Jefferson and that it means American policy will change. So what does Humboldt bring to the table? Other than a humanitarian's interest in equality and a naturalist's interest in curiosity and science, he brings a map. Humboldt, as I said, had heard about the Louisiana Purchase while he was in Mexico in 1803. And next to that, on the left, you see a map of the United States around 1800 showing vast empty spaces around Texas, Louisiana, and the further west Spanish possessions. Humboldt copied an earlier Mexican map as soon as he heard about the purchase, showing all of the Mexican intendencias up into Texas, stretching over to the southwest and down into Baja California. It is more detailed than anything Jefferson or Gallatin had access to when they sent Lewis and Clark out west just before Humboldt arrived. Humboldt, on the other hand, knows full well that the King of Spain is livid that Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States and not back to the Spanish Empire. And as a result, the Spanish king is not in a mood for pleasant negotiations over the border. The contested border between the U.S. and Spain is the subject of intense diplomatic negotiations, and Jefferson is scrambling to find information. So he quizzes Humboldt about topography. What can you grow there? Are there mineral deposits? What kind of people live here? And Humboldt arrives with most of those answers. He's willing to share that map with us, even though he has traveled through South America and Mexico on a Spanish passport. There are two reasons for this. The first is Humboldt believes in the free transmission of information. He believes that all knowledge should be shared among individuals, and he knows that he's going to go ahead and publish this map. He's just going to give us a 6-year head start. But he also wants democracy to succeed. And as a result, he is willing to loan us this map, potentially the single most important piece of geopolitical intelligence provided to the United States during this period as a way of leveling the playing field between the United States and Spain. Humboldt leaves his map with Gallatin, who promises to return it once he's made a copy. And what you see here is Gallatin's copy, housed today in the Library of Congress. Needless to say, by the time Humboldt leaves the United States, we are over the moon with this man. You can see that Thomas Jefferson will call him an ornament of our age. Dolly Madison will call him our Baron Humboldt, the most interesting traveler we have met, and in a letter expresses her hope that Humboldt will either stay in the United States and become an American, or at the very least come back and live out the rest of his life here. Before Humboldt leaves, Jefferson shows him a newspaper in which he's being excoriated in the press, and Humboldt is initially horrified, but then he changes his tune when Jefferson says, no, we're not going to lock up the journalist who wrote this. That's what freedom of the press is all about. The fact that we are willing to have that kind of free-form and open discourse is what Humboldt admires about us. The other thing that Jefferson does is he sends a letter back with Humboldt to be hand-delivered to the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, Lafayette is also on Napoleon's list of his least favorite human beings. And so Lafayette's mail is also being intercepted and censored, but this hand-delivered letter is going to make it to Lafayette without Napoleon's interference. And in it, Jefferson will introduce the two men, forging another lifelong friendship. But it also illuminates the fraught politics of transmitting information back and forth between Paris and the United States. So these two pro-American radicals, Humboldt and Lafayette, are joined by a third, Simón Bolívar, who will credit Humboldt with inspiring him to return home to his native South America to free Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru from Spanish-American rule. The three of them will become increasingly liberal as time goes on, opposing both the French and Spanish monarchies. And during the 1848 revolutions, Humboldt will join them in the streets with the rebels in his hometown in Berlin. So these three men end up earning Napoleon's undying enmity when they decide to skip Napoleon's self-coronation in 1805. Not surprisingly, Napoleon is furious, but it does not stop Humboldt's involvement with American politics. And in fact, in 1814, during the Treaty of Ghent negotiations, and that's John Quincy Adams in the brown suit in the middle, meeting with the British in order to end the War of 1812. It is Humboldt, who may be the man seated on the far right, who gets himself assigned to the Prussian delegation to argue for favorable terms on behalf of the United States. So who are the Americans who are there at Ghent? It's John Quincy Adams in the upper lozenge, and on the far left, a young Henry Clay. And at the bottom, our friend Gallatin, former Secretary of the Treasury and now one of Humboldt's closest friends. John Quincy Adams will follow Humboldt back to Paris. The two men will sit side by side in the French Academy listening to scientific lectures, going to the salons in the evening, having dinners together, and forging another friendship. It deepens the ties between the United States and Humboldt, who is now one of our country's strongest advocates. And in that regard, it ushers in an era where Humboldt becomes a magnet for American travelers abroad. Humboldt demonstrated that advocacy in 1837 when he wrote a letter of introduction for a traveling American to the Austrian Chancellor of State, Clemens von Metternich, whom you see on the right, in which Humboldt asserted, "I am practically an American myself." Humboldt often referred to himself as half an American. I think it's actually a joke because Lafayette was given full American citizenship, being one of George Washington's favorite people. And if Lafayette is a full American, that makes Humboldt a half an American. But it's also significant that Humboldt's admiration of American democratic positions will stop hard when it comes to the issue of slavery. That is the half of himself that Humboldt holds back. Although we will drag our feet on the abolition of slavery, Humboldt will never give up on us. And that's one of the things that keeps Humboldt relevant in American politics and as a gadfly for American democracy for the entire first half of the 19th century. His commitment to American ideals will also take root in American exploration and in the study and appreciation of nature. I mentioned that Lewis and Clark, whom you see here on the left side, had just left St. Louis when Humboldt arrived in Philadelphia. And there's a moment where Humboldt wants to take off after them because he thinks his instruments are better than theirs, and he worries that their measurements won't be very good. But of course, they stepped off the grid when they left St. Louis to go up the Missouri River, and it's not really clear that Humboldt could have found them. But Humboldt has Lewis and Clark in mind when he says, this country that stretches to the west of these mountains, in this case what you see here, the Blue Ridge and the larger Appalachian chain, presents a vast area to conquer for science. And it is those discoveries that will put the United States on the map with the international community. Right now, Humboldt is focused on the scientific wisdom brought back from those successive expeditions, and he will encourage us to link our cultural identity to what he will call natural monuments. One of the immediate effects of Humboldt's interest in the United States is that every expedition after Lewis and Clark will take an artist with them. Initially a painter, eventually a photographer. This is Titian Ramsey Peale, Charles Wilson Peale's youngest son, who was 8 years old when Humboldt came through town. Peale signed on with Stephen Long's expedition to the Rocky Mountains in 1819, and they carried with them an entire shelf of Humboldt's published writings as field guides. Humboldt, meanwhile, is in Paris, and he receives a copy of the Long Expedition report and shares it with the American author James Fenimore Cooper, whom you see here. The backdrop is Thomas Cole's painting Last of the Mohicans, based on Cooper's work. But as Cooper and Humboldt are comparing notes on the Long Expedition, Cooper is writing his book, The Prairie, which culminates with the concept of nature functioning on a literal and metaphorical level as a way of understanding American democracy. Cooper is joined in Paris by his friend Washington Irving, whom you see here in the lower right. And in Paris, it is Irving and Humboldt who will pore over antique maps in an effort to answer the question, how did America get named America and not Columbia? And they are the pair that discover that the earliest map with the name America on it, which you can see, yeah, you got it. It's like right there. Appears on the Valsey-Muller map of 1507. Humboldt's influence on Irving does not end there. Humboldt inspires Irving to go west when he returns to the United States, after which he will write A Tour of the Prairie and the Bonneville novels. Together, Cooper and Irving will establish a literary genre in which nature conveys America's moral character that will become really important again for an understanding of all of those democratic values. Maps are really important because maps tell you a great deal about how a country perceives itself. This is Henry Tanner's map from 1825, signaling the growing symbolic weight of the American West. It incorporates all of the features and nomenclature that Humboldt had included on the map that he left here, but I want you to focus on the cartouche in the lower left in that corner because a cartouche tells you what a map is really about. And if you look closely at it, we see Natural Bridge in Virginia in the foreground, and in the background it is Niagara Falls, 500 miles or so north in upstate New York. By eliding those two features, Tanner makes it appear that it is the Niagara River that runs underneath Natural Bridge. What the map maker has done has brought together symbolic natural monuments and index species of trees, plants, and animals as emblems of the unique nature of the United States. There's Jefferson's moose, there's a bald eagle, there's a beaver, and a rattlesnake. It's all about the symbolic things that make North America distinct from the rest of the world. Humboldt will also proclaim that nature and art are united in his work. And in fact, it will be the American artist Frederick Church, who painted the two works that you see here of Natural Bridge and Niagara Falls, who will be the landscape painter most deeply inspired by Humboldt. It's that perfect blending of art and science. And the beginnings of the Hudson River School, there will be strong associations between the American landscape, American patriotism, and democracy. So it's not really surprising there's also a collateral influence in the work of the American transcendentalist writers, Emerson on the left, Thoreau on the right. For Emerson, it will be a way of absorbing Humboldt to see how it inflects Emerson's own views. Emerson will describe Humboldt as having an extended center, expanded wings, who marches like an army gathering all things as he goes, how he reaches from science to science and from law to law, tucking away moons and asteroids and solar systems in the clauses and parentheses of his encyclopedic paragraphs. Emerson's vision is expansive. Thoreau, on the other hand, is going to go the other direction. And instead of looking upward and outward at the cosmos, Thoreau will turn that telescope into a microscope, aim it at Walden Pond, where he will catalog every detailed feature of that humble place. That literary impact will also extend to Walt Whitman, who will write part of Leaves of Grass with a copy of Humboldt's Cosmos on his desk. And when Whitman refers to himself as a cosmos, he is riffing on Humboldt, personalizing, internalizing, and distilling Humboldt's expansive views. That belief in the unity of nature and the unity of human beings and the concept of being part and parcel of the world's existence, there's a really wonderful book that encapsulates all of this that was really important to me as I developed my project on Humboldt, and that is Laura Dassau-Wall's book, Passage to Cosmos, Alexander von Humboldt and the Shaping of America. If you haven't had a chance to read it, this is also a book I would highly recommend to you. And there's another one too. The Humboldt Current by Aaron Sachs, which looks at 19th century exploration and the roots of American environmentalism. I think you would all enjoy that in order to understand the pervasive, saturating impact of Humboldt's ideas on the way we think about our relationship to the environment, which dovetails right back into the fine arts and into politics. Art, literature, and exploration will converge in our belief that America's cultural identity is bound up in the actual landscape, a concept that will find its most powerful expression out west. In 1903, Alexander von Humboldt's two fervent fans, Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, will embark on an epic camping trip in Yosemite. Their immediate goal is to protect Yosemite Valley, but they exchange insights on what they learned from Humboldt. Ultimately, we need to protect our natural monuments in the form of national parks that will go on to include Yellowstone, Yosemite, and the Grand Canyon. But Humboldt's concerns stretch beyond landscape as a symbol of democracy. Humboldt is fundamentally a humanitarian who believes that the way we treat people is the truest test of American democracy. The unity of nature is the unity of species. And he's considered the father of modern Mexican archaeology after his visit in 1804 for his comments on the Mexican calendar stone, which had just been excavated. 6-7 feet tall, he declared that this is hard evidence that pre-Columbian civilizations were once very sophisticated, beaten down by colonialism and imperial rule as a way of understanding a need for a more democratic system. This is the tide that lifts all boats. Humboldt will also express interest and concern for North America's Indians. He will ask Jefferson about the status of treaty negotiations. He will be appalled at the 1833 Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson, and he will send one of his protégés, the ethnographer Prince Maximilian Zuvide, to take the Swiss artist Karl Bodmer out west to retrace part of Lewis and Clark's path and come back with a combination of natural history, Indian vocabularies, and ethnographic histories. And in fact, the vocabularies and ethnographic data on all of the Indian tribes from St. Louis up the Missouri River into Mandan Indian Territory and what is now the Dakotas forms one of the lasting historical accounts of this particular tribe. Similarly, Humboldt will meet George Catlin when Catlin tours his Indian gallery in Paris in 1845. And here you see the frontispiece of Catlin's volume in which he has drawn a picture of Humboldt being introduced to one of the Iowa Indians who traveled with Catlin to Paris in 1845. The gesture of respect, making eye contact, eye to eye, meeting as equals, shaking hands, is at the core of Humboldt's personal philosophy. As Humboldt stated, all races are in like degree designed for freedom. It was a mantra he deeply believed in, and in 1804, during his visit to the United States, Charles Wilson Peale took him to Mount Vernon. Now, there are two reasons for this. First of all, George Washington had just died 5 years earlier, and Mount Vernon was very much in the process of becoming a shrine to our first president. And Humboldt is certainly well aware of and impressed by Washington's farewell address where he refuses to become a monarch. And in fact, Washington insisted on American democracy as a functioning rule, but instead of focusing on the portico and the view across the Potomac River, which is the way we usually see George Washington portrayed at Mount Vernon, Eastman Johnson, who painted this in 1857, focused instead on the slave quarters that attached to the backside of the house. And when we look closely, we see that every single person depicted in this painting is Black. That's important for our story because the people Humboldt really wanted to meet when he went to Mount Vernon were not George Washington's descendants. He wanted to meet William Lee. He wanted to meet the formerly enslaved people who had been there when George Washington was alive, to understand their experiences, to be able to try to square the father of our country with the perpetuation of slavery under a Declaration of Independence that presumed that all men were created equal. American slavery was the puzzle Humboldt couldn't solve. It's the conundrum that drove him crazy about our country. When Humboldt arrived, he also sent a letter to James Madison, Secretary of State, and delivered a not-so-subtle dig when he wrote, "I've seen the spectacle of the Andes in South America, and now I intend to enjoy the spectacle of a free people worthy of a great destiny." It's kind of, you could be doing a little bit better on this front. And it's at Mount Vernon that the words that Humboldt will write later come into clear focus. Humboldt will refer to slavery as, quote, possibly the greatest evil to have ever afflicted humanity. As early as 1825, Humboldt will write to a friend of his, Heinrich Berghaus, predicting that if America can't solve this problem, it will probably cause a civil war that might be the end of the nation. Prescient words for 1825. Certainly the prediction almost came true in 1861 and seems like an elegant frame for where we find ourselves today. Where race and exploration come together is in the person of John C. Fremont, the American explorer known as the Pathfinder, who was also very happy to be called the American Humboldt in the 1830s. And in the 1840s, he led 4 expeditions out west, nominally to find potential railroad routes in advance of the Transcontinental Railroad, but also taking that opportunity to name everything he could after Humboldt. You see an illustration from one of his travel guides that depicts the Humboldt River Valley, but there's also the Humboldt River Basin and the Humboldt Mountains. It's the reason we have a Humboldt County in California. In fact, everything that is named Humboldt in the United States is named for Alexander von Humboldt, and everything collaterally, including Humboldt Fog cheese, owes its name back to Humboldt by association. Well, needless to say, by naming everything after Humboldt, it caught the explorer's attention, and Humboldt was more than happy to integrate Fremont's findings into his own books, call him out, and compliment him by name. And then in 1850, California did something truly extraordinary. It joined the United States as a free state. That was something of a shock. Most people assumed California would enter as a slave state, and Fremont becomes California's first senator. Humboldt is delighted and writes a letter commending him for the role that he played in ensuring that California would represent freedom. Now that's really important, both for the country and for the depiction of Yosemite as a landscape emblematic of freedom, which happens during the American Civil War. And then in 1856, John C. Fremont ran for president as the candidate of the new splinter group off the Whigs. Fremont is the first Republican Party candidate for president. Lincoln is the second. And he runs on an abolitionist platform drawn straight from Humboldt's writings. And in fact, Humboldt's letter endorsing Fremont will become part of the campaign literature in support of Fremont's bid for the presidency. And the motto that you see in this amber type is Fremont and freedom. Humboldt endorses his candidacy and is crushed when Fremont loses to James Buchanan. He writes a flurry of letters expressing his concern that we have lost our best hope at avoiding civil war. Humboldt's words also appear in the columns of Frederick Douglass's North Star newspaper, and Douglass himself plays an important role in the understanding of Humboldt's words on abolition in the African American community, and among the New England abolitionists because of this woman, Ottilie Assing. For about 28 years, Frederick Douglass is romantically involved with Ottilie Assing, the woman you see here. She's a German journalist. She's the niece of Humboldt's best friend. She will make sure that Frederick Douglass's autobiography is translated into decent German, and that when he goes on a book tour, that there are German sites on the itinerary. The two of them work together in order to send abolitionist material from Germany to the United States. In order to make sure that the abolitionists in the US are aware of Humboldt's writings, in 1858, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society named Humboldt their Man of the Year. This is a letter that you see from William Lloyd Garrison up at the top, who owned the Liberator newspaper, asking Theodore Parker, his fellow Boston abolitionist, to speak on Humboldt's behalf and make him the subject of an address at their annual get-together on the 4th of July. Theodore Parker does this, and the address is published and widely. Parker and Garrison, I might add, are also two of the Secret Six, John Brown's powerful supporters. 3 of them are also devotees of Humboldt, which raises the question as to how deeply John Brown's rhetoric owes something to Humboldt. He did, as we know, live for a while in an abolitionist community in Kansas called Humboldt, in his belief that abolition is a core necessity for America's survival. Even up until the week that Humboldt dies in 1859, Humboldt is still meeting with American travelers in Berlin, still calling himself half an American, still reminding him that the half that he is withholding has to do with the fact that he loves this country, but he hates the politics that continue to enslave people. It is something, as I said, he will never let go of, but he will never let us go either. Even after Humboldt's death, his words resonate. In 1864, at the New York Sanitary Fair, created to benefit the Union cause, New York businessman John Matthews will take a letter that he's received from Humboldt in which he takes apart Daniel Webster for his support of the Fugitive Slave Act, and he turns it into a carte de visite that is distributed for the benefit of sick and wounded soldiers in the U.S. Army. Matthews sent a copy of this carte de visite to Abraham Lincoln with a letter in which he said, "Sir, I know you were familiar with Humboldt's words. I am sure they bring you comfort at a time like this." Humboldt's passionate belief in abolition was reinforced by some of his most influential friends in Paris, who were also Thomas Jefferson's friends. On the left, you see Madame de Staël, one of the leading intellectual women of her generation. Her salon also drove Napoleon crazy, but it attracted people like the Marquis de Lafayette, whom you see on the right, Simon Bolivar, and of course Humboldt himself, and a cast of Americans who traveled to Paris, including Edward Everett and George Ticknor from Boston. The salons attracted liberal thinkers. They tended to be pro-US in their outlook and anti-monarchical for the same reasons. Helena Maria Williams, who was one of Humboldt's translators, also held a salon. And in fact, it's important to note that for women in Europe, as in America, the system allowed them to interact with and participate, disallowed them from interacting and participating in scientific, political, and artistic discourse at the highest level. So what would they do? They simply invited all of the people from the lecture halls into their living rooms and continued the conversation. It was their way of gaining access to the halls, denied them membership by dint of their sex. So the salon is a staging ground for involving women in finding their own voices and becoming active and vocal participants in political, cultural, scientific, and artistic matters. What you see here is a painting of one of those European salons, giving you again that the realization it is both men and women, it is art and science, it is an opportunity to break down or at least fray the edges of some of those gendered spaces. So in the United States, Thomas Jefferson had enjoyed those salons in Europe when he was an ambassador to France, and he returned convinced that America needed its own salon system. As president, he encouraged women, including Dolly Madison on the right, and Margaret Bayard Smith, the wife of Jefferson's favorite journalist, Samuel Harrison Smith. It is in that cultural backwater of Washington, D.C., that both ladies hosted salons during Humboldt's visit in 1804, bringing together the luminaries in town in order for Humboldt to experience the beginnings of American cultural events. I should also note that Jefferson did not show up for those. He actually allowed the women to gather the gossip and then fed it back to him. Washington hasn't changed much in 200 years. Humboldt had a specific influence on women as writers and thinkers. This is Susan Fenimore Cooper, author James Fenimore Cooper's daughter. She met Humboldt in Paris, and with his encouragement, she became a natural history writer. And this is her first book, Rural Hours by a Lady, because you couldn't put your own name on it at that point. And then there's Elmira Lincoln Phelps, Emma Willard's younger sister, who wrote her familiar lectures on botany, which became a staple in K-12 education for both boys and girls. We think there are over 300,000 copies of this printed between 1829 and the 1860s, but I want you to notice the frontispiece, which you see sideways right now, because it is based on Humboldt's massively influential plant geography map, which is designed to correlate altitude, climate, and the distribution of plants. And as a result, it is a Humboldtian primer on how botany can teach you about everything from climate to agriculture to patterns of cultivation. I should note it's still being used today, 250 years later, but the plants have moved upslope by as much as 1,000 feet thanks to climate change. So this is the totality of Humboldt's plant geography map, and the side columns carry all of the statistical data that gets involved in that discussion. Now, Emma Willard will also make use of this map in her study of climate and agriculture because she creates this isothermal chart of the climate drawn from Humboldt and others. And you'll notice that not only has she identified 10 separations in mean temperature between the equator and the frozen poles, but that all of the boxes in the middle, which I give you a close-up of, define the characteristic plants in each of those. Those of you who are gardeners know that we still use this. It's called the USDA zone chart in order to decide when or if and when we can plant things and when it is safe to do so. We've also known that the USDA has also shifted those zones northward with climate change. It is this version that is drawn from Humboldt and then personalized and particularized to the United States. Humboldt deliberately made his lectures available to women. And I show you the building in which he delivered the lectures that became the basis of his book, Cosmos. The German poet Karl Holtei went to one of those lectures in Berlin, where he described 800 people, standing room only, all there to hear the one speak. A third of them were women. It seemed important for Humboldt to recognize that smart people came in all packages and that your gender really didn't matter. It didn't really matter the color of your skin or your geographical point of origin. What mattered was, are you curious? Are you literate? Are you interested? Are you willing to put in the work to understand the world around you? And it is that democratic, egalitarian perspective that recognizes that the unity of nature includes the unity among all human beings. For Humboldt, the institution in the United States that most closely embodies all of his cherished ideals is the Smithsonian. You see James Smithson on the left and Alexander von Humboldt on the right. As it would turn out, and maybe not too surprising after hearing this lecture, Humboldt and Smithson knew each other. They met in 1790 before Humboldt came to South America. When Smithson was a young chemist in the Royal Society, they met in Henry Cavendish's laboratory. And they met again in Paris in 1814 during Napoleon's last days, when Smithson spent close to a year in Paris with Humboldt and the entire French scientific community. After boozy dinners in the Bois de Boulogne making fun of the British as they are losing the War of 1812, one of Smithson's friends will make the comment, "If I were a man of means, I would live anywhere in Europe except England, and I would invest my money in America." And invest in America is exactly what James Smithson did. In his will, he left his entire fortune to found an institution based on the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men in a continent he never visited and a city he did not know. He patterned it off of Humboldt's open-minded motion of learning to being accessible to all information being transmitted to everyone, and that collective enterprise is the rising tide that lifts all boats. At the core of Humboldt's desire for the increase and diffusion of knowledge is his desire for a well-educated and compassionate populace. From the outset, we are designed to absorb and reflect and refract his ideas. We stand for his commitment to universal equality. We stand for his ideas and his concerns for planetary stewardship. And we stand for his ceaseless pursuit of knowledge, now more than ever. Thank you. Now comes the fun part, because I open my up to basically anything that you decide you want to ask me.
How are his first journeys funded?
Self-funded. His mom, his dad died when he was about 10. His mother wanted him to become a banker. He was horrified. They settled on mining engineer. And he actually invented the gas mask that you wear in mines literally the canary in the coal mine. He created one of those because he realized there was a need for it. After his mother died, he basically had to fake it until she died, and she left him enough money that he was then able to basically say, screw this, I'm going to travel. And at that point, Napoleon had invaded Egypt, so that's off the hook, and he's mad at Prussia, so that's off the hook. To be fair, later on, after Humboldt comes back from South America, given the nature of his writings, the East India Company convinces England not to let him go to India. So, you know, there's this notion of as long as he can afford to do it, he does it himself. So literally, he shows up in the Spanish court, and he's trying to talk to the Spanish king and queen because he has an audience with them, and they're like, yeah, I'm not really sure. And finally he said, it won't cost you a dime. And I will bring you back maps, population studies, you know, this, that, and the other. And the King of Spain's like, not a dime. And he goes, I'll pay for it myself. And he's like, here's a passport, don't die of yellow fever, have a nice day. And at that point, Humboldt literally put it all together and sailed for Cartagena. He does bankrupt himself after self-publishing 36 extremely large hand-colored volumes, which is when he has to leave Paris, which is the center of the scientific community, because the Prussian king in Berlin feels that Berlin is now a backwater, and he doesn't like that. And he basically tells Humboldt, stipend, come back home. And Humboldt's like, do I have to? And he's like, yes. But they did negotiate. Humboldt was actually very puckish about it. He said, I am like one of those opera singers where for 3 months I can be wherever it is I want to be, and I choose to be in Paris. So literally every year he is back and forth. But the reason he does his lectures in Berlin, he effectively jumpstarts the German scientific community. I mean, we think of Germany as being a leader in science. Partly it is because Humboldt goes back home.
Was he fluent in all those languages?
He knew at least 8 languages, and he often switches back and forth between them. There's a moment in the United States where he's traveling with his botanist, Aimé Bonpland, who only speaks French, Carlos Montufar, who's the son of an Ecuadorian nobleman who only speaks Spanish, and his audience. Peel's French isn't great, but his English is good. And so literally he is hopping back and forth between the languages. And at first I thought, well, you know, that's just exuberance. We do this. No, he's trying to keep everybody included in the conversation. He doesn't want anybody feeling left out because they don't speak the language. His brother, Wilhelm, is the actual linguist, probably closer to 17 languages. And is considered the smart one. So, you know, Alex was the one who came home with rocks and lizards in his pocket, and his brother was the one who was immersed in books. Alex hated the classroom, Wilhelm thrived in it. So every time Alexander was given a book on languages, he would hand it off to his brother. Yes?
Yes, so one question from our chat online here asks, from Sarah, says she loves The Invention of Nature, it's one of her favorite books. Why do you think that Humboldt was not known or hardly known for learning about American history?
A funny thing happens when Humboldt dies in 1859. First, you have to consider the timing. We're about to tip into civil war. We kind of take our eye off the ball here. In 1859, when Humboldt dies, there are Humboldt celebrations in every major city. There are monuments built to him, Humboldt Park in Chicago. There were Humboldt fountains in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia. There is a Humboldt monument, of course, outside the Natural History Museum in New York. There was a Humboldt celebration in Boston. In 1869, when he would have turned 100, there's a renewed sense of activity with that. Louis Agassiz and the Transcendentalists in Boston host a 3-day event. But that's really the last. And there are Humboldt celebrations in the United States every year that ends in a 9 until 1909. And what happens then is that Humboldt isn't German enough to attract the attention of the Germans in World War I and World War II. And he's not American enough to withstand anti-German sentiment, particularly around the 1930s. In the 1930s, libraries took German language books off of their shelves. People changed their surnames. They stopped teaching their children their mother tongue. Street names were changed. Monuments were taken down and melted down for armaments. And it's kind of like the lights went out. And when we come out of World War II, by that time, Humboldt, the great thing about Humboldt is he synthesized it all and made it seem like we should have known this all along. But what happens is everybody else builds on that. And so Louis Agassiz will actually say in 1869, every American school child has had Humboldt as his teacher, he just didn't know it. Because Humboldt doesn't ever control any one discipline. So you've got scientists who are noted for particular accomplishments. Humboldt has literally got his fingers on the entire course curriculum for a liberal arts college. You can start in anthropology, you can end in zoology, and pretty much every department in there Humboldt had an interest in. And so he's kind of the undercurrent, but other people get the credit for it. And in the 20th century, you don't have, as Aaron Sachs will point out, you don't have an environmental movement without Humboldt. Rachel Carson does not mention his name in Silent Spring, but Silent Spring is about the downstream consequences of removing DDT from the environment, and that is a Humboldtian concept about understanding downstream consequences and interconnectedness. It isn't really until Carl Sagan reanimates Cosmos, but even when he does it, he doesn't really talk a lot about Alexander, he simply springboards off of that. And for me, what I found is working on American landscape painting, all of my landscape painters were reading Humboldt. 1/3 of the second volume of Cosmos is advice for landscape painters. There's a reason that Frederick Church thought he was talking to him when he said, go to South America. But I think that it goes from being this transformational, saturating, omnipresent thing. If you run a keyword search in historic newspapers for Humboldt in the 19th century, if it doesn't crash your computer, you've got a really robust system. He's everywhere. By the 20th century, he's been supplanted by other voices, but those voices actually acknowledge the shoulders that they stand on. It's just it gets dissociated. So in short, politics and the inevitable and wonderful march of scientific discovery.
The author of Passage to Cosmos, what was that name?
Laura Dassow Walls, W-A-L-L-S. She taught at Notre Dame. She's also written really wonderful books on Emerson and Thoreau's interest in science. She's a very engaging writer. And I must admit, when I first read Passage to Cosmos, it made me think that this topic had already been done. And then the more I dug into it, the more I realized, no, it was a model for how to think across disciplines in order to understand how you can sort of find the warp and weft of somebody's influence where he doesn't always, pop straight up. And I think that, I owe a great deal to her and to Aaron Sachs and to Andrea Wolf for helping to shape the way I think about things, to shape the way you tell stories, but also to recognize that Humboldt is like an endless well of material. I've given maybe 8 or 10 different types of Humboldt talks since 2020. And there are 6 or 7 places in the middle of this talk where we could have taken a sharp left or right turn and done something totally different. And that's, I think, the thing that I most appreciate about it is, which again, that restless, endless curiosity, that 4 hours of sleep a night, which basically means I think Emerson actually did the math and realized that he lived an extra 60 years based on American sleeping habits. And all that coffee. He had a parrot named Jakob, and when he would see the manservant come in, he would yell, "Mehr Kaffee, mehr Zucker, mehr Kaffee, mehr Zucker." The stuffed parrot is in the Natural History Museum in Berlin. Missing a wing from the fact that the building got bombed during World War II, but he's still with us. Yeah.
So another one online from Steve says he has your book from the exhibit at the Smithsonian and was wondering if you knew anything about Humboldt's spiritual life as it relates to the themes that you discussed.
Yeah, actually, Humboldt's spiritual life is an interesting question because there were a lot of people, particularly in the United States, who were horrified when they read Cosmos. There is no mention of a creator. There is no mention of a supreme being. It's like, wait, what? And Humboldt kind of danced around it, but what he did in the first volume, the second volume of Cosmos is on landscape. The first volume is a world history of philosophy and science. And he talks about Buddhism, and he talks about Christianity, and he talks about Taoism, and he talks about religions and different world cultural systems and the way that these cultures connect with nature going back millennia. And he kind of gets puckish about it, and he never really sort of says, why would you settle for one? It's more like, why do you need one? So kind of a cheerful atheist is the way I would put it, where I think he was much more interested in how you could actually comprehend all of this, but he was never derogatory about it. He didn't feel the need to take it apart, he just didn't feel the need to embrace it.
How old was he when he died?
He was 89 years old. He was pushing toward his 90th birthday. Missed it by like 5 months or something. Had a massive stroke, and he had had a mild stroke earlier in the year, and still was writing. This is a man who just never stopped until finally he did, and it was fairly quick, and seemingly painless. He left a lot of outstanding bills. His last domicile was owned by the Mendelssohn family of music, and so he ended up owing them a fair amount of money, which they ended up squaring up later on. But the one thing I will say about Humboldt is he did not seem to have an ear for music. There was one salon where they brought in someone to play the violin, and the second he started playing, Humboldt chose that moment to turn to the person next to him and rather loudly kind of talk him through his latest argument. And then when the violin music stopped, he shut up. And then when it started back up, so did he. So one wonders about poor Felix Mendelssohn in all of this, but I'm a big Mendelssohn fan. I kind of hope he would have liked that a little bit better, maybe. But I think that Humboldt, in diary after diary of people who spent evenings with Humboldt, at some point they will all say the same thing, which is basically, Humboldt, as usual, talked away. This is a man who just never stopped talking.
Did he stop long enough to have a family?
No, he did not have a family. He was very close to his brother Wilhelm, who was a diplomat in London for a while, and his sister-in-law, Caroline, but no, he didn't. And his sexuality is a point of discussion. Andrea Wolf actually touches on it. There's not a lot there. We think a lot of personal letters may have been destroyed by his manservant, who was left basically the residuum of the estate. But the closest we can get is a correspondence between Wilhelm and his wife. Humboldt was headed to London, and he wanted to stay with his brother, who, being a diplomat, kind of has to pay attention to the niceties of things. And England has rather strict laws about homosexuality. And in fact, James Smithson's best friend got bounced and ended up living in Genoa, where they didn't care. And so Wilhelm will write to his wife and say, it would be unseemly for Alexander to stay with me. You know him, he always has his favorite. This time it's the French astronomer Arago, and I can't have both of them under my roof. Caroline will write back to him and say, Alexander will never find happiness in the arms of a woman. That's what we've got. I think it is quite plausible that he was gay. I think that he was clearly someone who attracted the attention of both sexes. Dolly Madison had a crush on him. You get into her letters and she just gushes. He had entourages of women following him around in Paris and in Berlin. And he just seemed to be extraordinarily affable, but I think that he usually just simply brushed things off and said he did not have the time. Sure. Yes.
A Vermontian question. Do you know, by chance, any connection between the impact he had on Justin Morrill? Justin Morrill, the senator who was one of the early scholars of...
I think that, I don't know about that specifically. I do know that when George Perkins Marsh wrote Man and Nature, he had Humboldt in mind. And so there is definitely a road through Vermont that carries Humboldt with you. But again, the notion, the whole setup at Marsh Billings Rockefeller is essentially kind of it's a Humboldtian approach to land management, to the idea of arts and politics and science, all sort of, happily interwoven with each other at right about the same time period. But when George Perkins Marsh starts talking about the fact that he believes that the Confederacy is doomed because of bad land management by monoculture and ripping the soil from the nutrients by overplanting cotton and tobacco, he cites the fall of the Roman Empire as being bad husbandry too far from home, so that you couldn't actually feed what you had absorbed, and that he felt that any kind of a flawed agricultural system was essentially the road to political disaster. That was George Perkins Marsh in, I believe it's in the introduction to Man and Nature, which was written in 1864. The first truly environmental book is written, pretty much here. So not here, but here. We played a game when I was working on this exhibition. You've got the, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. And we actually stuck with 2 degrees of Alexander von Humboldt for the exhibition, because once you get past the people who met him, corresponded with him, read him while he was alive, that was the criteria for being included in this exhibition. Because once you get past that, it becomes epically diffuse in a way that becomes harder and harder to track back specifically to him, and becomes more a way of saying it's in the air, it's in the water, it's just accepted wisdom. How do you know it was Humboldt? So, you can do 6 degrees of Humboldt. It's actually not that hard to do. I had a research assistant who fed our social media accounts with Humboldt trivia every day for 18 months. Without ever having to repeat anything, I believe. Patrick Jackson, if you are out there, it was a massive and gleeful enterprise. We linked as many to anniversary dates as we could, but when we left off with that, we just ended up with, this is the week we're going to talk about this. And we would just basically feed you Humboldt trivia on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, just because we think that if Humboldt had had access to those things, he might not have even gotten 4 hours of sleep. He's a little bit like Wikipedia and Google, trapped in the same room together. And it's a little overwhelming, but yeah, I think he would have genuinely enjoyed social media. Email, oh my God, he would have loved it. No Napoleon censoring things. And in fact, when Samuel F.B. Morse develops the telegraph, and Humboldt realizes this is secure communication, he actually arranges to have Morse presented to the French scientific community, and France is one of the first countries to actually pick up the telegraph as an official form of communication. This is in the 1830s. And in fact, Humboldt is already kind of envisioning a secure means and an instantaneous means. I mean, he's waiting like 6 months for a letter from Jefferson, because one of the things that you have to remember is during the entire first half of the 19th century, the Atlantic is suffering multiple naval blockades. It is almost impossible. In fact, Humboldt's his French botanist had to have a second passport in order not to be, if they got boarded by a Spanish ship in the Atlantic, to not have him arrested. So letters aren't getting back and forth. It is not uncommon, it turns out, for the Marquis de Lafayette to write the same letter to Thomas Jefferson, make 3 copies of it, and send them by different couriers, hoping that one of them would make it. So the idea of being able to instantaneously converse with somebody, oh my God. Yeah, if he'd had email or Twitter, yeah, 2 hours of sleep a night. Well, anyway, thank you very, very much for coming. It's a pleasure for me to sort of extend Humboldt's enthusiasm through me to all of you. Thank you for your questions, and thank you very much. I hope this gives you plenty of reason to want to expand your horizons on a literary matter and go diving down some of the same rabbit holes. Thank you.